Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. The first part of Max's story begins with an eerie sense of isolation and impending betrayal. Max is lying in the intensive care unit, motionless, hooked up to the machines keeping him alive. The room smells antiseptic, cold and impersonal. As he listens to the faint rhythmic beeps of the heart monitor, the sound a painful reminder that his body is fragile, vulnerable. But something else is off. He can hear voices, familiar voices, and his heart races though his body remains motionless. It's Camilla, his wife, standing close by. Her voice is sweet and full of affection, like a doting wife who hasn't left his side since the accident. But Max knows it's all a lie. He heard the doctor earlier mention that Camilla had hardly been around during the first few days after his accident, and now, as she sobs softly and speaks to him, it all seems too forced, too well-timed. A new voice joins the conversation. It's John, a man Max vaguely remembers but never paid much attention to before. The casual tone of his voice, as if he belongs there, triggers something dark in Max's mind. John says something that turns Max's blood cold. "We need to figure out the property," John whispers. "But first, we need to keep him alive, just for a bit longer." There's a silence, and then Camilla's voice, lower, venomous. It's not like he's going to wake up. Max wants to scream, to move, to tear the tubes from his body and expose them, but his limbs remain limp, helpless. The rage burns within him, so powerful it feels like it could tear him apart. They think he's already dead, just a vessel holding on to life long enough for them to take everything he's built. Max silently vows to fight. He'll claw his way out of this coma no matter what. So for now he waits and listens as the wife he thought he knew conspires against him, planning his end. This is just the beginning. Lying there in the dark, Max felt like a prisoner inside his own body. He was trapped, suffocated by the weight of betrayal that grew heavier with every word Camilla and John exchanged. Their voices were faint, muffled by the noise of the machines keeping him alive, but they were clear enough to make him sick with rage. He couldn't move a muscle, couldn't open his eyes, couldn't scream at them to stop. All he could do was listen, and burn in his helplessness. "I told you," Camilla hissed, her voice no longer sweet or concerned like it had been just moments ago when the nurse was in the room. "We need to be careful. If he dies too soon, it'll be suspicious, they'll look into the accident. I can't have that." There was a pause, and Max could feel the tension in the air. John's voice was lower, but Max caught every word. "I get it. But how long do we have to keep this charade up? We're sitting on a gold mine, Camilla. The sooner we can get rid of him and start cashing in, the better." Gold mine. Max's thoughts swirled around those words, his mind flashing back to the life he'd built, the business he'd grown from nothing. He had been smart, cautious, and he trusted Camilla with everything. He thought she was his partner in this life. Now the truth hung in the air, thick with venom, and he was powerless to stop it. They were plotting to steal it all, his money, his assets, even his life. Camilla's voice softened, taking on that sickly sweet tone again. "Patience, John. Well, we can't make mistakes. Once the will goes through and the property is in my name, we can move forward. Then you'll have your cut. Until then, we keep him alive just long enough for everything to be legally mine. It won't be long now." The sound of footsteps came closer, the shuffle of hospital slippers on cold tiles. Max could feel the bed shake slightly as someone leaned over him. Her voice was inches from his face, a mocking sweetness dripping from every word. "Max, darling," she cooed, "I'm doing everything I can for you. The doctors say you'll pull through, but we both know better, don't we?" Her hand brushed his cheek, and it took everything in Max not to flinch. She was touching him with the same hands that had probably touched John, the same hands that would eventually sign the documents handing over his entire life's work. Inside, he was screaming. The door to the room opened, and Max heard the familiar voice of his doctor. "Miss Bennett, how is everything going? Any changes?" Immediately, Camilla's voice shifted, taking on the concerned, heartbroken tone she had perfected. "No changes, doctor," she said with a heavy sigh. "I just don't know how much more of this I can take. Watching him like this, it's tearing me apart." Tearing her apart? Max wanted to laugh, but nothing came out. The doctor must have bought her act because he didn't stay long, just offered a few comforting words before leaving the room again. So soon as the door clicked shut, the mask fell off, and Camilla turned her attention back to John. "We need to move fast. I'm not sitting here every day pretending to care." The doctor said his condition could go either way. He might wake up or he might not, but I'm not waiting forever. John, sounding impatient, muttered, "Well, what do you suggest? We need him alive for a little longer, don't we?" Camilla sighed. "Yes, but that doesn't mean we can't speed things up. There are ways to make sure he doesn't come out of this." Max's pulse quickened, though his body lay still. "Speed things up?" They were planning to kill him, but not in some dramatic way. It would be slow, subtle, maybe an accident with his medication or a sudden complication. They wanted him out of the way, but in a manner that wouldn't raise eyebrows. His thoughts raced. He had trusted Camilla, let her into every corner of his life, and she was plotting his murder. She and her lover were standing over him, talking about how and when they'd finish him off. The rage inside him was like a firestorm, roaring and thrashing, demanding to be unleashed. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let her win. Max had no idea how long he'd been in the coma, no sense of time in this strange half-world he was trapped in. But one thing was clear, his survival was the only thing that could save him. He had to get out of this bed, had to fight his way back to consciousness. But how? His body refused to cooperate. His limbs felt like they were encased in concrete, but his mind was sharp, sharper than ever. Inside, he made a vow. He wasn't going to let them win. They thought they had him cornered, thought he was as good as dead. But they were wrong. He was going to fight his way out of this coma, and when he did, there would be hell to pay. Camilla and John left the room shortly after, their footsteps fading down the hall. But the echo of their words stayed, burning in Max's mind, fueling a determination he hadn't felt in years. And he was going to survive, not just for himself, but to expose them, to rip apart the life they thought they could steal from him. He would wake up. And when he did, they wouldn't see it coming. The days dragged on in a blur of mechanical beeping, sterile air, and the cold weight of dread pressing down on Max's chest. He could hear everything but was trapped in this immobile prison. Time lost all meaning as he lay there, helpless, listening to the hospital's rhythms, the distant chatter of nurses, the shuffle of feet. Yet, despite it all, Max's mind burned with a single white-hot focus: survival. He had to fight back, but he didn't know how. His body refused to respond, remaining as still as death itself. His thoughts were all he had left, but they were sharp, cutting through the fog of helplessness. If he could just move a finger, a hand, anything, it would be a start. He spent hours, maybe days, trying to force his body into action. He focused on the smallest movement, willing it to happen. But nothing. And then, one afternoon, he heard their voices again. Camilla and John, back in the room, standing over him like vultures. They were more comfortable now, less cautious, as if they believed Max had truly slipped away for good. "I talked to the lawyer," Camilla whispered, her voice cold and businesslike. "Everything is moving along smoothly. Once the papers are signed and the estate is transferred, we can finally be rid of this inconvenience." Inconvenience. That's what he was to her now. Max had spent years building a life for them, for her. But he trusted her with his heart, his fortune, everything. And now she saw him as nothing more than a roadblock to her new life with John. The anger that simmered inside him was almost unbearable. John's voice broke through, more impatient than before. "So how long until we can pull the plug? I'm not sticking around much longer. We can't drag this out." Camilla sighed, the frustration evident in her tone. "The doctors are still unsure. They keep saying it could go either way, but the moment we can make a move, we will. I won't be tied down to this much longer, believe me." Max's blood boiled. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the rage giving him a strange sense of power. They wanted him dead, wanted to kill him slowly, but Max wasn't going to let that happen. His body still refused to obey him, but his mind was alive with fury. They thought they had everything under control, that they could simply wait him out. But Max knew something they didn't. He wasn't giving up. Camilla moved closer to the bed, her hand brushing his arm. "Soon, darling," she cooed, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Soon you'll be at peace, and so will we." Max swore silently to himself. He wasn't going to make this easy for them. He wasn't going to be their victim. He focused all his energy, all his rage on a single thought: move. Just move. And then he felt the faintest twitch in his hand. It was small, almost nothing, but it was a start. And Max knew, in that moment, that he still had a chance. Days bled into each other as Max lay there, still trapped in the prison of his own body. He was painfully aware of the world around him, listening, waiting for an opportunity. The hospital had become his personal purgatory, but each passing moment was now filled with a new sense of purpose. So that small twitch in his hand had given him hope, the tiniest signal that he wasn't completely helpless. But if he could do it once, he could do it again, and then more. It was only a matter of time. Time was something Camilla and John didn't seem to care about, not in the way Max did. They moved around him like sharks circling a wounded prey, growing more confident with each visit. They whispered, plotted, always assuming Max couldn't hear a word. It enraged him, but he knew he couldn't let that anger consume him. Not yet. He had to stay focused. It was late in the afternoon when they came again. Max could hear the shuffle of feet, the soft creak of the hospital door as it swung open. The familiar click of Camilla's heels on the tile floor was like a dagger through his chest, a reminder of how much he had once loved that sound. Now it was a soundtrack to his betrayal. "You know," Camilla said, her voice smooth and calculating. "It's almost done. The lawyer said once the next set of papers goes through, it's just a matter of formalities. The assets will all be transferred. I can't wait to be rid of this mess." John's voice was closer this time. "What about the doctors? Have they said anything? When can we finish this?" "Finish this." Max felt bile rising in his throat, the rage bubbling up again. They were so casual about it, as if they were discussing an errand they needed to run, not the murder of a man. His man. The man she had once promised to love for the rest of her life. Camilla sighed, as if inconvenienced. "They're saying he could hold on for weeks or even months. But that's just not an option. There's no way I'm going to keep coming here every day pretending to care. We need to speed things up." Max's mind raced. Speed things up? What were they planning? He wanted to scream, to throw himself at them, but all he could do was lie there, listening. "Focus," he told himself. "You've moved before. You can do it again." John's impatience was growing. "How are we supposed to do that? You said yourself we can't be obvious about it. We need it to look natural. The last thing we want is the doctors getting suspicious." I know, Camilla replied, irritation creeping into her voice. "But there are ways. I've been looking into it. I'll talk to the nurse about adjusting his medication. It's subtle. They won't notice, but it'll be enough. We'll just let nature take its course a little faster." Max's heart pounded in his chest. They were planning to kill him, to manipulate his medication, and make it look like a natural decline. They had to stop them. But how? He could barely move a finger, let alone defend himself. But now, more than ever, he knew he had to fight. He had to push through the fog, the paralysis, the pain. His life depended on it. Camilla's voice softened again, but there was a twisted edge to it. "Just be patient a little longer, John. Once it's all done, we'll have everything we need, and we can finally move on. Together." John grunted in agreement, and Max could feel the smug satisfaction radiating off of him. He was a parasite, feeding off Max's hard work, ready to steal everything he had built. The thought made Max's blood boil. He wasn't going to let them win, not without a fight. The door creaked open again, and the sound of footsteps signaled that a nurse had entered. Immediately, Camilla's tone changed, dripping with fake concern. "Oh, thank you so much for coming," she said, her voice trembling as if she were holding back tears. "I'm just so worried about him. He's been like this for so long. Is there anything more we can do?" The nurse spoke softly, reassuring her, but Max couldn't focus on the words. His mind was elsewhere, turning over everything he had just heard. Camilla was going to try and manipulate his medication. She was going to kill him, and she was going to make it look like the doctors had done it. As Camilla continued her act, Max knew that he didn't have much time left. He needed to act soon, before they had a chance to carry out their plan. He focused all of his energy on his hand, willing it to move again. It felt like an eternity, the silence stretching on as he pushed harder and harder, until finally he felt it. A twitch. Then another. It wasn't much, but it was enough to fuel his hope. Max knew that if he could just hold on a little longer, if he could keep fighting, he would make it out of this. And when he did, Camilla and John wouldn't know what hit them. Max lay in the hospital bed, his mind burning with the need to act. Each visit from Camilla and John had become a countdown, their whispered conversations tightening the noose around his neck. They were growing impatient, eager to speed up his death. The more they talked about manipulating his medication, the more Max realized how desperate his situation was. Time was running out, and he needed to push harder, to fight harder. The twitch in his hand had been a small victory, a sign that his body wasn't entirely lost to him. But he needed more. He needed to move, to communicate, to find a way to let someone know that he was still in there, trapped but alive. Camilla had been so convincing in her act as the concerned wife. The doctors believed her, the nurses pitied her. No one would suspect that she was plotting his death. No one but him. He focused again, trying to recreate the twitch he had felt the last time she was in the room. His mind sharpened, zeroing in on his fingers, willing them to move. Every nerve felt like it was wrapped in chains, but he fought through the pain. The stiffness. He had to. His life depended on it. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside his room. He strained to hear, hoping it wasn't Camilla again, but the steps were softer, lighter. A nurse entered the room, checking his vitals, adjusting the machines. Max could feel the shift in the air, the warmth of her presence, but he still couldn't open his eyes. He tried to move his hand again just a little, something to signal that he was still here. Nothing. His body remained lifeless, defying his efforts. He wanted to scream, to cry out, but all he could do was lie there in silence. The nurse's soft voice broke through his frustration. "You're doing okay, Mr. Bennett. I know it feels like a long road, but you've got people who care about you. Just hang in there. People who care." If only she knew. His wife was the one trying to kill him, and no one would believe him. The frustration built like a pressure cooker inside his mind, but he couldn't give in. He had to stay focused. There had to be a way to get through to someone. The nurse finished her check and left, the door clicking softly behind her. Max was alone again, left with nothing but his thoughts and the sound of the machines. He knew Camilla and John would be back soon. He didn't have much time. He concentrated on his hand, pushing harder than before. His entire being was focused on making just one movement, one signal that he was still in there. And then, after what felt like an eternity, his fingers twitched again, this time more noticeable. A spark of hope flared inside him. He could do this. It was small, but it was progress. He wasn't done fighting yet. Max's entire world had shrunk down to that single twitch of his hand, a tiny flicker of movement that felt monumental. It wasn't much, but it was progress. He could feel it deep in his bones. He was clawing his way back. And he had to. There was no other choice. Camilla and John were tightening their grip around his neck, and if he didn't act fast, their plan would succeed. But how long could he keep this up? He still couldn't open his eyes, couldn't speak, couldn't scream for help. His body felt like a leaden weight, heavy and unresponsive. But that flicker of life in his hand gave him the faintest sliver of hope. His mind, though weary, was sharp, and his anger kept him going. If he could just make enough movement, anything to alert someone, to let them know he was still here, he had a chance. The footsteps came again. They echoed softly, growing louder as they approached his door. A familiar dread crept up his spine. He knew it was Camilla and John. His heart thudded in his chest, quickening with anticipation. They had no idea he was listening, plotting, preparing for the moment he could strike back. The door creaked open, and he could hear their voices immediately. Camilla's heels clicked sharply on the floor, and she gave the theatrical sigh of exhaustion she always performed in front of him. "I can't keep doing this," she said, her voice thick with feigned sorrow. "I just don't know how much longer I can bear it. Watching him like this, it's torture." John's voice was low and impatient, just as Max expected. "We can't wait much longer, Camilla. And if you've been dragging this out, we need to act, and soon. If we wait too long, someone might get suspicious." Max could hear Camilla move closer to his bed. He could practically feel her hovering over him, her presence sickening. I know, she said quietly, her voice soft and deceitful. "I've been talking to the nurse about adjusting his meds. A small change in dosage, nothing too obvious. It'll look like his body just gave out on its own." John's tone darkened. "Are you sure they won't notice?" Camilla gave a bitter laugh. "Of course not. They're doctors, not detectives. His condition has been deteriorating for weeks. It'll just look like a natural decline." Max's heart raced. They were planning to poison him slowly through his own medication. It wasn't just a theory anymore, it was a solid plan, and they were getting closer to executing it. Panic clawed at him, but so did his fury. He wouldn't let them win. He focused again on his hand, willing it to move like before, to give him that small victory. Just one twitch, something to show he wasn't as gone as they thought. Nothing. John's voice cut through the silence. "The lawyer's ready. Once the paperwork goes through and he's declared dead, we can start transferring everything. The house, the business, his accounts will be set for life." "Good," Camilla replied, her voice as cold as ice. "We've waited long enough. I'm sick of pretending." Max felt his body tremble ever so slightly, a tiny movement that neither of them noticed. His anger was growing, his determination hardening with each word they spoke. He was still here. They couldn't see it yet, but he wasn't going to let them destroy everything he had worked for. He wouldn't let them win. They thought he was helpless, but they were wrong. Camilla leaned in closer to him, her breath brushing his cheek. "I'll come by tomorrow and talk to the doctor. We'll make sure everything is taken care of." John sighed. "It's about time. I'm getting tired of waiting." They both stood there for a moment, the tension in the room thick, and then the familiar click of her heels sounded again as she turned and walked to the door. "Tomorrow," she whispered to John, "it'll all be over soon." The door closed softly behind them, and Max was left alone again, drowning in the silence of the room. His mind was racing. Tomorrow, that's when they planned to finish him. He had less than 24 hours to make a move, to let someone know that he was still alive and fighting. The panic that had been bubbling beneath the surface exploded inside him. He had to act now. He couldn't wait anymore. He couldn't rely on the tiny twitches of his hand. He needed more. He needed to break through the fog of his body and find a way to move, to scream, to make sure someone realized what was happening. His focus sharpened again. He pushed harder, concentrating every ounce of his energy on his hand, his fingers, anything that would obey him. His mind felt like it was being torn apart by the effort, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. If he did, tomorrow would be his last day on Earth. Then, something happened. His fingers twitched again, but this time it wasn't just a flicker. He could feel a small surge of energy running through his hand more than before. He pushed harder, and his finger moved a real movement, not just a twitch. It was slow, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Max exhaled inwardly, relief flooding his senses. He could do this. He wasn't dead yet. Tomorrow, they'd find out just how wrong they were. Max had barely slept. Not that he could tell what time it was in the fog of the hospital room, but his mind was too wired, too full of racing thoughts and burning anger to rest. Every second counted now, ticking away as he fought against his unresponsive body. Tomorrow, Camilla and John would make their final move, and he had to be ready. They thought he was as good as dead, but Max had already moved his fingers. He had taken that first step. Now he needed more. He focused again on his hand, willing his fingers to move with everything he had left. It was exhausting, his muscles stubborn and sluggish, but there was life in them. He could feel it. The small twitches were growing, turning into slight movements. He just needed to keep pushing. The door opened, and Max's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't time for the doctors to make their rounds yet, which meant only one thing: Camilla was back. Her heels clicked softly as she walked into the room, humming softly to herself. There was no John this time, just her, and that made it worse. Max knew she was dangerous on her own, more calculated, more cunning when she didn't have to pretend for anyone but herself. The door shut quietly behind her, and she stood there for a moment, watching him. "Well, here we are again, darling," she said, her voice dripping with mock tenderness. "I know you can't hear me, but I like to think you can feel how close we are to being free." She moved closer, sitting on the edge of the bed as if she were actually concerned about his well-being. "It's a shame, really. You were a good provider, Max. You made sure we had everything we needed. But I need more than that now. I need a life that doesn't involve you." Her hand brushed his cheek, a sickeningly intimate gesture that made Max's skin crawl. He could feel her fingers trace a line down to his chest, pausing as if she were savoring the moment. "I'll miss this, being in control. You trusted me with everything, and look where it got you." Max surged inside him, the urge to break free and throw her off him overwhelming. His fingers twitched again, stronger this time, but still not enough for her to notice. She was too absorbed in her own twisted monologue. "I'm sure John will handle everything once you're gone. He's a bit impatient, but I've always been good at calming him down. You wouldn't believe how easy it was to get him wrapped around my finger." She laughed softly, a sound that grated against Max's soul. "You were always so focused on your work, your precious business. You never saw it coming, did you?" She stood up, walking around the room, inspecting the machines keeping Max alive. "The doctor says we should see some changes soon. They've adjusted your meds just like I asked. It won't be long now, darling." She leaned in close to his ear, her voice a whisper of venom. "Tomorrow, it's all over. The business, the house, everything will be mine." Max's heart pounded in his chest, the thumping almost deafening in his ears. His fingers twitched again, and this time he tried harder, focusing everything he had on making a more deliberate movement, that he could feel the connection between his mind and his body strengthening. He had to show her he was still there, had to give her a reason to doubt her victory. Suddenly, his hand jerked. It wasn't much, just a slight movement, but it was enough. Camilla noticed. She froze, her eyes narrowing as she turned toward him. "What the?" Her voice was sharp now, the mask of confidence slipping for the briefest moment. She stepped closer, staring at his hand, waiting for another sign. Max willed his fingers to move again, and slowly, they did. The tips curled just slightly, enough to be seen, but not enough for her to be sure. For a second, Max thought she might panic, might realize her plan wasn't as airtight as she thought. But then she laughed, a brittle, forced sound. "Oh, Max," she said, shaking her head. "A muscle spasm. Is that your grand comeback?" She reached out and gripped his hand, squeezing it gently as if to test him. "Even if you wake up, you're not going to stop what's already in motion. You're too late." Her grip tightened, and Max felt a sharp pain shoot up his arm. She wasn't playing anymore. The sweetness in her voice had turned to cold steel. "You're not coming back from this," she whispered. "Tomorrow, it's over. No more games." She let go of his hand and straightened, her expression hardening as she turned to leave. "Sleep tight, Max. Tomorrow we're pulling the plug." The door clicked shut behind her, and Max was left in silence again. But this time, he felt a burning sense of determination. She had seen him move. Maybe she didn't believe it yet, but she had noticed. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. His mind was clearer now, the path forward more defined. He couldn't let them win. His body might be weak, but his spirit was anything but. Max flexed his fingers again, this time more deliberately, more confidently. He wasn't just trying to survive anymore, he was preparing for the battle ahead. Tomorrow, everything would change. They thought they could silence him, bury him before he had a chance to fight back. But they were wrong. Tomorrow he would wake up. And when he did, there would be no mercy. They thought he was helpless. But they were wrong. The night passed in a haze of tension and anticipation. Max lay in his hospital bed, his mind sharper than ever, fully awake and aware of the battle he was about to face. He had spent hours pushing his body to its limits, trying to regain control over his limbs, focusing on every muscle, every nerve, to make even the smallest movement. His fingers had curled and twitched, his toes had flexed slightly progress, but not nearly enough to escape the death trap that Camilla had set for him. Morning came slowly, the light filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across the sterile room. Max could hear the muffled sounds of the hospital waking up, the soft clatter of trays, distant voices, and the rhythmic beeping of the machines that surrounded him. He knew today was the day. Today Camilla would come, and with her, the final act of betrayal. His mind raced through everything he had heard over the past weeks, the cold, calculated plans, the greed in Camilla's voice, the impatience in John's. They thought they had him beat, that he was just a few breaths away from death. But Max wasn't going to let them win. He wasn't ready to give up everything he had built, everything he had fought for. Today, he would wake up. He had to. As the morning dragged on, the door to his room opened, and Max's pulse quickened. So you could tell by the footsteps that it wasn't the usual nurse. These steps were slower, more deliberate, filled with purpose. Then he heard her voice, soft and dripping with false concern. "Camilla." "Good morning, darling," she said, her tone light, as if she hadn't spent the last month plotting his murder. "It's a beautiful day outside. The kind of day that makes you think about new beginnings." Max's skin prickled at her words. New beginnings for her, that meant a life without him. A life where she and John would take everything he had built and leave him in the ground, forgotten. But Max wasn't going to let that happen. Not today. "I've spoken to the doctors," Camilla continued, moving closer to his bed. "They think it's time. You've been holding on for so long, Max, but it's time to let go." Let go. Max's rage flared up again, hotter and more intense than ever. She wanted him to give up, to die quietly, so she could get her hands on his fortune. But she didn't know the fire that was burning inside him, the determination that had grown stronger with every word she had spoken. He wasn't done. Not yet. Camilla leaned in close, her breath warm on his cheek. "They'll be here soon, Max," she whispered. "It's time to say goodbye." Max could feel her hand on his arm, a final gesture of false tenderness. He focused all his energy on his hand, willing it to move, to grip her wrist with everything he had left. He had practiced this moment in his mind over and over, pushing his body to respond, to show her that he wasn't the helpless victim she thought he was. And then it happened. His fingers closed around her wrist, weak but unmistakable. Camilla froze, her breath catching in her throat as she looked down at his hand. Her eyes widened in shock, and for a moment she couldn't move. "What the?" she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time. She tried to pull away, but Max tightened his grip, his eyes still closed, but his mind more awake than ever. He could feel the panic radiating off her, and it gave him strength. He wasn't done. He wasn't going to die today. Camilla yanked her arm free, stumbling back in horror. No, this can't be happening," she muttered, her voice shaking with disbelief. "You're supposed to be." Her words trailed off as she backed away from the bed, her eyes darting to the door, as if she were contemplating fleeing. But Max wasn't done yet. He wasn't going to let her walk out of this room without knowing that she had lost. With every ounce of strength he had left, Max forced his eyes open. The light was blinding at first, but slowly, his vision cleared, and he saw her, the woman he had loved, now twisted with fear and betrayal. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Camilla really saw him. You're awake?" she stammered, her face pale, her voice barely above a whisper. The power dynamic had shifted, and she knew it. Max didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said everything. He was alive, and he knew everything. Every word she and John had whispered. Every vile plan they had concocted. Every moment they had thought they were in control, he knew it all. And now they would pay for it. The door opened suddenly and the doctor entered, followed by a nurse. Camilla stepped back quickly, trying to regain her composure, but her pale face and wide eyes betrayed her fear. "What's going on here?" the doctor asked, looking between Max and Camilla. Max's gaze never left Camilla's face as he struggled to form the words he had been holding inside for weeks. His throat felt raw, his voice barely more than a whisper, but it was enough. "Help," he croaked, his eyes still locked on his wife. "She tried to kill me." The room fell silent. Camilla's face drained of color as the weight of her actions finally came crashing down on her. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, but no words came out. The nurse rushed to Max's side, and the doctor quickly stepped between him and Camilla. "Mrs. Bennett, I think it's best if you leave," he said firmly. Camilla hesitated, her eyes darting between Max and the doctor, before turning and rushing out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. She was gone, but Max knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Max lay back against the pillow, exhausted but alive. He had won the first battle, but the war was just beginning.